multi-platform political communication for public opinion mobilization during election. Dr. Mohapatra's work has been cited in the Time magazine, the BBC, HuffPost, AFP, Wall Street Business Standard, Open Magazine, and several other mainstream media publications. So we all are eagerly waiting to hear from Dr. Mohapatra and to get enlightened and enrich ourselves. So over to Shongita, please. Shongita, are you there? Yeah.
Yes. Can you also see me?
Yeah, you are audible. Hi.
I'm audible and I'm visible.
Yeah, both.
All right. Thank you so much for inviting me here. And thank you so much, Savitri, for the introduction. And Damdam Motiji, Rabindra Mahavidyalaya for inviting me. One thing that struck me when I was waiting here for all of you to come was that seeing that this is a fairly representative audience, that all of you represent different disciplinary fields, and that's great because information is a topic that works at the intersection of several other disciplines. It's just not related to political science or international relations or anthropology or computer science or like sociology or media communication studies. What we feel is that this is a truly interdisciplinary subject matter. And to study disinformation, we need the expertise of these different disciplines to have a well-rounded view of this topic. Another great thing about this topic is that it's a lived experience. We are all going through this as it is happening and unfolding. And how do we make sense of something that when it is a lived experience? Because our biases might latch on to this, our research work. So let me tell how I will go about this session. What I want to do is, because it's a vast topic with a lot of strands and areas that we need to look into, it's not that simple as fake news that Chris Silverman of BuzzFeed had coined. It's something far, far pernicious, deep-rooted, and entrenched in our system. And given that democracy is fast digitalizing, democratic processes and interactions are becoming more and more digitalized as more and more people are onboarding into mobile communications, and the gap between politicians and the people is eroding. It's fascinating that we need to revisit certain concepts like public opinion, public culture, political communications to know how are these evolving given the current dynamics of internet and social media and messaging services facilitated platform communications. So this talk is going to go somewhat like this. First, I'll give you a macro view of what all as researchers are we looking at disinformation. These are just broad guidelines. And from there, we will suss out certain important areas that if y'all as audience, as researchers, like I see all of you have some impressive profiles, all of you are interested in doing research on disinformation, can think about. And these are basic goalposts to help you along the way. So I start with a few cases, a few examples that always we all know who are like from 2000 in the like I've been studying propaganda, which is offline, and we all know that propaganda is as old as human civilization. But how does digital disinformation, and I'm alluding to digital disinformation here, is so qualitatively different? What makes it what makes it so much more of a threat than the agitprop that we had faced all these years back? And internet and social media communications, it's self-evident fact, is a catalyst in a big way of amplifying the effects of disinformation. Uh, Even in ancient history, as some of you, I'll start with a small anecdote because I love drawing parallels with history. And this is a question I keep getting asked in different conferences is that what's so different about disinformation? It's just fake news, it's just junk news. What in media studies, like I see some of the audiences are from media college, that uh, that it is simply junk news, which has always been there. Objective news is a 20th century invention. Before that, everything was about opinions, and opinions were always prey to biases and propaganda. So, if you remember that if the history professors, whoever has a history, who loves history, will realize that even when the Roman civilization, when we had the republican system in Rome, at that time, there was a general, Roman general called Octavian, who went on to become Augustus, the first Roman emperor. He had started a disinformation against Antony and said that Antony is a stooge of Cleopatra, and how he had done it. He had taken these small, small coins, which were circulated, they were common currency, and in those coins, he had made his informers stamp propaganda and cutting smear campaigns against Antony, calling him drunk, a womanizer. And those coin-based information is what we can draw a parallel with our modern day tweets, which bring down politicians and all. So, and that actually had an effect in mobilizing the Roman public opinion against Antony, and which led to Octavian. This was one of the strands, one of the important strands that information warfare that actually helped Octavian become a powerful politician and gain a foothold in the public domain and consciousness. It's not everything, but it was a main part. So propaganda is as old as human civilization. And now imagine if we magnify that, like we remove the state dispensers, and we bring in multiple actors involved in bringing it right to your mobile devices. All of you are holding a mobile device. It comes right to you. How do we deal with such a thing? And if you have money, then you are the king of whatever you say. So let me start with how did academic interest in disinformation suddenly spike up? 2016 proved to be a year of reckoning. First, we had in Germany something called the Lisa case. The Lisa F case in 2016 was about this 13-year-old girl. And Germany, as you know, after the Syrian crisis, a lot of immigrants started coming to Germany from West Asia, from Middle East. So there was a subterranean resentment against immigrants, the outsiders. However, Germany was a very nice, and I can vouchsafe for it, it's a very nice place for outsiders. It's not that hostile to outsiders. However, in 2016, what we see is that this Lisa F case was about this girl who is of a Russian German descent. She's a 13-year-old girl. And one day she disappears from school and no one knows what's happened to her. One day later, she comes back and she cries her heart out saying that I have been raped by 3 men of Middle Eastern descent. And that played into the narrative of an outsider of a Middle Eastern descent being culturally perverse, being not as civilized as the Germans, who are bringing with them certain bad habits. Mind you, this was not done by the German media. This was done by the Russian media. Germany has a huge concentration of Russian and Germans. I'm not going to talk to you about how Russian disinformation played a role in US elections, because that's common knowledge and you all can get information about it. Let me talk to you about cases which have not got media attention yet have been extremely important to know how disinformation actually works. So you have this huge concentration of German and Russian population in Germany. They are quite influential, and this girl was of Russian German descent. And there was this huge hue and cry by the German media, by the Russian media in Germany, that see, the German police are not taking her seriously. The German politicians are not taking her seriously. And look at her. She is being, a minor has been raped by these outsiders. German media constantly downplayed this and said, no, let us get the facts first before we pronounce a judgment. Because that's the way German media, which is pretty conservative, works. Nothing doing. This extreme disinformation or this kind of amplification, fear mongering, this kind of stereotyping of outsiders was built to a fever pitch where Angela Merkel felt cornered and she had to reply that no, this is something that is got up. Later on, it was found out that this girl was lying. It was a got up case. The police came out with reports about her mobile phone, which clearly showed she was lying. And yet, Russian television channels and their digital outlets ramped up the disinformation campaign and kept it on till 2017. And this created a lot of schisms and tensions in the society and anger against the immigrants. This is a classic case of a disinformation campaign, and let's understand by top-down disinformation, which is the most dangerous disinformation, the top-down disinformation. In this case, what was found out that previously Germany had criticized Russia for its annexation of in the Ukrainian crisis and Crimean annexation, and Russia had led the European Union efforts for sanctions against Germany. Right on the heels of this campaign, a small criminal news story became the poster child or the major issue of a major disinformation campaign, and which actually had real world ramifications because there was huge protests and demonstrations and there was no truth to it. So this was one case of a disinformation campaign which happened in Russia. I will come down to the definition, but let's give you a perspective. Second, which all of us disinformation scholars actually look to when we want to see the laboratory of disinformation, something that can be a bellwether of future trends of disinformation, and that is the Philippines. In 2016, during the presidential elections, Rodrigo Duterte, he had started what we see now. Okay, I'm not supposed to talk about certain places, but what we see now in full swing, where extremely powerful political parties use digital armies to suppress detractors and to promote a particular agenda, that started in the Philippines. And this is what Katie Horvath, she's the global policy director of the elections of Facebook page called Patient Zero of Disinformation. Philippines was the patient zero of disinformation. What is patient zero? All of you have been reading about the COVID pandemic. So who was the patient zero? Patient zero was the person identified as the super spreader in the Wuhan wet market who actually spread the virus everywhere. So Philippines was basically the patient zero of the infodemic. What is the disinformation that we start seeing? Where what we find that it was used in a big way to to completely social engineer opinions by using these huge digital armies. That also happened in 2016. And again, what we see in during that time, whatever information comes from what can come through the cracks of the Great Wall of China. We also find that China also had from the state something called the 50 cent party. What is the 50 cent party? 50 cent party was basically uh, a digital army of 2 million state employees of the Communist Party, and they were responsible for generating 450 million posts per year, which were disinformation. So, Germany, Philippines, China, and then comes the Brexit referendum again in 2016, where a narrative was pushed telling that Britain is being short shifted by being a European Union, by being attached to the European Union, and that we need to be an island because our great UK power has to be there together. We need to be economically strong, and we cannot be that if we stick to the European Union. And that was found to be pure lies. And there's a documentary on Netflix. I'm sure all of you can go and all of you are binging on Netflix. There's a brilliant documentary about the Brexit referendum, and there is a very good journal article if you're interested to know how this happened, because all those discourse analysis, those of the research scholars who are interested in critical discourse analysis can check out Zaccattini's article about the Brexit referendum and how it created different alternative narratives. So after the Brexit referendum, even the same year, 2016, we had the United States presidential election campaign with Donald J. Trump coming to power. And basically, he has been the face of what we see as disinformation. And Washington Post has been keeping, unlike certain media of different countries, keeping track of what the supreme leader of their particular country is lying through his teeth about. So these are certain examples which stimulated in academic interest in disinformation. And that's where people started not talking about propaganda or agitprop or false fake news, which was written about in BuzzFeed by Craig Silverman. You can please check out his writings on this, or Ben Nemo of the DFR Lab. They deal a lot about these fake news, which is actually called junk news. But here, for the first time, an academic structured attention was focused on the topic of disinformation, where it was felt that since it dealt with society, since it dealt with multiple platforms, we needed an expertise which needed to combine both measurement studies of computational social sciences along with qualitative studies, ethnographic studies, which needed to meld it together to understand this multifaceted phenomenon. Now I come to what exactly do we mean by disinformation. So by 2016, as the academics' attention started growing, by 2017, there was this initiative by Harvard and many other universities to find some sort of a definition about what do we mean by disinformation. And here a work came by Claire Wardle and Hossein Derakhshan, and they are the ones who have started something called First Draft, which actually gives us a very good benchmarks about the definition, the categorization, and the taxonomy of the different disinformation, types of disinformation, misinformation. So they call this the information disorder. Why they called it the information disorder? That is, what is different between information and disinformation? because disinformation, as European Union disinfo stated, always has a grain of truth around which the falsehoods or manipulated content is built. And that's what makes it dangerous, because ultimately it is not totally lies. It has that one kernel of truth in it. And that is what we call faction, where you combine fiction with facts, and that is how it can become really, really dangerous. So, Geraction and Waddell in 2017 created a taxonomy which researchers could follow in the information disorder, and they categorized it as disinformation, misinformation, and malinformation. What do these three things mean? Disinformation is basically when there is an intent to manipulate, the person who is sending that news, creating that news, disseminating that news, knows it to be false content, something that has to be, that is a propaganda material, a persuasion material, because there's a difference between persuasion and propaganda material, and they basically spread it. Misinformation is when we see something which is a false information, but we don't actually believe it to be false, probably because it confirms our biases or our worldviews, and we spread it to people. We believe in that information and we spread it, like our WhatsApp family and friends groups. So that is called misinformation. Now, what is malinformation? Malinformation is basically when there is a clear intent, this is very important, clear intent to do harm, like hate speech. All these are not disinformation and malinformation and misinformation, they all intersect. But these are some of the clear categorizations. So hate speeches comes within the remit, the functional area of disinformation, which is also a malinformation. Now, what kind of disinformation? And here too, Waddell categorized it into 7 forms. The first form was satire and parody. Now, satire and parody it's not that it doesn't have an intent to harm. It might have an intent to persuade, but there is not an intent to create harm. And that's what I think is we need to factor in mind when after this session, or probably you all know what I'm saying already, but when you all go back to your social media posts and your traditional mainstream media posts, broadcast media especially, you all will be able to categorize these informations by these when you see this. So satire and parody was discounted by general consensus of many of the American, the European researchers as let's not take that as disinformation because that muddies the water and it's not epistemologic, it becomes a bit difficult to deal with it. So let us instead focus on the other 6 categorization of disinformation. And what are the other 6 categorizations? The first categorization is called misleading content. Now, what is misleading content? You take an event and you take a person, either of these, and you frame the event with information that misleads someone. That's called misleading content. And that is different from the second category, which is called manipulated content. What is manipulated content? So while misleading content takes an event and a person and puts in a different twist to it, gives a different interpretation to it. Manipulated content basically takes an event as it is and then changes the kind of information that is substantiated to explain that event. That is called manipulated content. So I might mislead, I might manipulate. It's difficult, I understand, to make clear-cut division, but as you start reading all these content, slowly and slowly you get a sense of what is purely misleading and what is purely manipulated. The next one is called fabricated content. Third category. What is fabricated content? Fabricated content is completely false information. I give totally false information about an event and say, this is what has happened. That is it's pretty self-evident, so I don't need to explain that. And we go to the fourth category, which is called false connection. False connection is basically you take a person and you falsely connect the person or an event with something. You take a headline, for example, the headline and the picture in a digital content, given that all of us suffer from something that is called attention deficit. Usually media scholars will know this better, that in any media publication, whether it is digital or print, the first paragraph is the vital paragraph that shows whether I'm going to actually engage my attention in this article. Especially now when there is an information overload and we need to pick and choose which articles we are going to read. So here what we do is we basically read the headline, we read the teaser, the full quote, or we read the we see the picture. So here the false connection is when the headline and the picture does not match the story, and that's called false connection. And the last category is called the false context. Means we provide, there's an event, so there's a false connection with the visuals and the headlines, and false context is when the propaganda works in giving the wrong context to an information. That something has happened, but we say that it is the background story is what we manipulate, and we take it as something different. Like if we say that someone has killed someone, we give a story of communities fighting each other, and we place it in, like if something has happened in Syria, we say that this has happened in India, then that is false context. So these are, to sum up, these are the major categories of disinformation, that is misleading content, manipulated content, then you have fabricated content, you have false content, you have false connection, and there is something interesting also, the last category, which is called imposter content. Imposter content is that this happens a lot on Twitter and Facebook, where someone takes a profile of a public figure and projects to be that person and starts spreading propaganda there. So this is basically the categories of disinformation. Now, coming to the second part of my topic, so this is what I refer to when I refer to as disinformation. Coming to the second definition of the topic, which is online radicalization. Now, scholars of political violence know that there are so many definitions, and there is a definitional dissensus about what is terrorism, what is insurgency, what is political violence, and online radicalization is basically the process of how someone becomes a terrorist or an insurgent in conventional security studies. But now we have come to modern security studies, where we can no longer talk about online radicalization happening only to certain groups of people, but a mass online radicalization. And here I borrow Ariel Merari, the Israeli expert on suicide terrorism, who is basically a pretty objective. I found him to be pretty objective. He doesn't carry the biases of his state. Where he talks about the conveyor belt process of radicalization. It starts with uh, if I'm going to self plug here. So if you all are interested, you all can check up my LSC paper where I talk about how in digital disinformation by the Indian political parties, how that happened in their social media communications. So how does it happen? It first starts with name calling. You think that it is okay to call someone by a pejorative term, and you think that has social sanction. That is the first red flag of radicalization. From the name calling comes in digital disinformation, it can come to mimetic warfare, where you put in misleading memes. And nowadays, memes have become a major source of information, especially for the youth-based crowds about info. So misleading memes, which gives misleading information in a form of satire or pun. But this is basically not satire or pun, but pun. This is purely misleading information to pull down an out group or a community or a political leader. So from name calling, you graduate into mimetic warfare. From mimetic warfare, you go graduate to something called hashtag warfare, where as the citizens, as more and more you're getting polarized and more you're feeling something is very bad, you start piggybacking on certain hashtags which are trending, which are against the group that you are aligned against, or hashtags which you support. And you start going there, and what does this do? Basically, hashtags amplify an opinion and massify an opinion, giving them the critical mass. From name calling to mimetic warfare to hashtag warfare, then it goes down to trolling and abuse. Pure trolling and abuse. This is like no holds barred attack on a particular community or a person or a public figure. And from there, it goes down to online violence threats that I'm going to, you deserve to die. Now, all of you have read the Constitution of India, and you know, and the Indian Penal Code, and you know, and not just for India, for different countries of the world also, all these violate common law. And yet, in digital space, they get away with it despite community guidelines and regulatory guidelines of platforms because these have been normalized. So, online radicalization ultimately it creates this kind of anger where it can go into call to action uh, uh, speeches where people will tell, go and kill these people. And that's where radicalization hits the highest peak. And that is what I define as radicalization, which is the distilling the purest emotions into binaries of truth. Where I am no longer, I don't believe this to be, there to be any shades of truth. I feel that this is right, this is wrong. My party is right, your party is wrong. So there is a clear cut binary. And this is a purest form of radicalization. So now that we have gone into the definition and the radicalization, let's go into the process of how it usually happens. I spoke about the Lisa campaign. I spoke about Duterte. I spoke about the 50 Cent Party, Germany. So how did they do that? Uh, Basically, it's called micromedia manipulation. In broadcast media, what happened? It was always a one-way communication. Micromedia communication is that you go right down to different people in a community, you profile them, and you target your messages accordingly so that they become influenced by you. And this is called micromedia manipulation. And micromedia manipulation takes place by seeding propaganda material after profiling people from they get this data from social media platforms, and they decide to target people according to their predilections, their biases, their political affiliations, and these so these companies basically this whether it's whoever is a disinformation agent, he will seed that campaign in a particular group, and that basically I will seed the propaganda in discrete voter segments through misleading memes, through troll farms, bot armies, through sock puppet networks, through imposter news media, and through this I will hack their attention, and I will hack their attention and I will manipulate the conversation. In case you want to know what sock puppet network means, sock puppet network means that people who pretend to be something they are, means there are human beings and bots when they're together, they're brought in to manipulate the public. Like you don't know they are real, just like bots. Bots are basically algorithms and bots through which it's not human, but it is algorithmically driven. These and these pretend to be humans, but they basically generate it. They generate an opinion, a perception. Sorry, which shows that an opinion has mass acceptance, which we call astroturfing. So there is a sense that this opinion is widely accepted by a lot of people. Troll farms are basically the tech savvy youth, the call centers who have become, the people who don't have jobs or who, due to either motivation of either they believe in it, in a propaganda, or they want to make money out of it, they decide to become trolls, and uh, they basically through aggression and abuse try to cow down a critique and opposition. They are the trolls. So bots are not human, trolls are human, and sock puppet networks are basically a combination where imposters happen. Imposter news media is very important, and I would suggest this is something which I'm personally interested in. If you go to Facebook, you will see people sharing a lot of memes, political memes, with a lot of political parties, and these memes are from particular web pages on Facebook. And when you go to the about section of these web pages, you will see that they call themselves news and entertainment or news and current affairs media. They call themselves news media. Now, we all know that news media has to go through certain, regulations and formalities to actually classify to be a news media, a certification process. A random person opening a Facebook page and calling themselves news media is not news media. Yet, we see that in Facebook, they have got a lot of online traction, and these people have become the new news media sources. And this is what we call imposter news media. So micromedia manipulation through all these, through this army of trolls, bots, sock puppet networks, imposter news media, and influencers like celebrities, sports persons. Often it is good to have people who are not from the political field, corralling them and making them a part of your network where they say that, oh, this political party is good and that political party is doing bad, and and their their followers start believing this. So through all this they start micromedia manipulation of content. This is the basic playbook of disinformation that was started by Duterte in Philippines and which got replicated in different parts of the world in a big way. And Duterte basically called it patriotic trolling. This is what Marissa Ressa, she was recently arrested, unfortunately, and she's a leading light. Like you have this coronavirus warriors, you have this leading light of fake news busters. She was the CEO and the chief and the executive editor of Rappler, and she called this patriotic trolling, where online state-sponsored hate and disinformation campaigns were used to muzzle the voice of critiques and create a narrative of especially populist leaders, because from 2008 onwards we see the rise of populist leaders after the liberal economic dispensation was discredited. You see most of these inward populist leaders. So how did they do this? Basically, they did this. This patriotic trolling was done by hiring something called the black hat PR firms. What are the black hat PR firms? So you have political parties and all doing positive social media campaigns, and there would be character assassination and smear campaigns, but it wouldn't be that dirty in their official pages. For that, they would hire something called the black hat PR firms, where there is whom they would keep at an arm's length. No one can actually relate those PR firms with those political parties. So they have this deniability factor that okay, we didn't hire them. We don't know why they're doing this. But they would hire these black hat PR firms, public relations firms, who would do these shadow campaigns. What are these shadow campaigns? Basically, with the positive campaigns on the official handles, you would have the shadow campaigns of negative campaigns about a political rival or a community or something that is the vested interest of the disinformation agent. So what we see that from 2016 onwards, and this from a cottage industry of professional black hat PR firms, what we have seen is these operations have scaled up as disinformation has become an accepted and entrenched form of political communications and campaigning. There is no political party that doesn't, that I don't find, at least the countries that I am seeing, that any political party that is decrying or shunning disinformation, they are all doing it. The difference is that those who have money and reach do it better. Those who have less money and reach, they still do it, but they can't do it to the scale that the others do it. So we tend to think that one party is doing more than others. Unfortunately, disinformation is something that is plaguing everyone. All parties are doing it. So what has that led to? That has basically led to political trolling becoming professionalized trolling. Black hat PR firms from being cottage industries have now scaled up into multi-million dollar businesses where you have third-party tracking, you have data specialists, you have ethnographers, everyone pulling in, plus content creators, content disseminators, and this huge pool. Now we will have more of such pool of unemployed people who will be thinking that, okay, the one recession-proof industry is trolling, so let's join that. And that's what is going to, that's what scares me, is that disinformation, despite a lot of attempts to fight it and identify it, is not happening. The last part of my, so I have told you about the definition, the agents involved, usually the top-down agents, and the processes involved, the affordances involved. And now when it comes to radicalization, what is the consequences of disinformation? Excuse me, let me just sip. So the last section is something where the research is still at a nascent stage. A lot of Americans and Europeans are trying to do measurement studies of hyperpartisanship, political polarization. But this is basically very limited in the scope because it's specifically related to a particular audience segment and people. And most of this is machine-based measurement studies which doesn't actually go to the ground level to find out what makes people believe the things they believe, even when they know it is false. Because studies have shown that even when you are exposed to false news and someone corrects you about it, the opinion is divided here that whether do I believe it or do I debunk it or do I say no, I'm wrong. People don't like to be told that they are wrong. They don't like to be corrected. And this is something research needs to be mindful of. That if how does fact checking work? Does it work or does it have a limited appeal? How do we need to improve fact checking? Last year, while studying WhatsApp, I went around India and I tried to speak to people. I spoke to around 200 people, students. I spoke to people in Bangalore, in Calcutta, mostly in urban areas, not in rural areas. Presuming that the urban areas are still, people who actually access news, because there are very, amongst our mobile devices, we don't access news as much as entertainment. That Statista and all these studies show. But we assume that people in urban areas access news to a larger extent on their mobile devices. Because in India, most of the people are onboarding India, Brazil, where there's huge disinformation, Russia. People are onboarding immediately through mobile, digitally, rather than anything else. And so, how does hyperpartisanship work? So, here, concepts like echo chambers and filter bubbles came up. That is, uh, on platforms, algorithms are designed in such a way to push you towards news based on the kind of previous behavior you show. Facebook does that. Many other platforms do that. Twitter does it to a lesser extent, being a broadcast platform. Instagram does it in a big way. Facebook does it in a big way. So they push you towards news. They curate news and show you news they think you would like to see, and that is uh, algorithmically driven. So that shows that basically you are driven into filter bubbles where you hear news which subscribes to your biases and worldviews, and you don't see that much of alternative opinions. And related to filter bubbles is something called echo chambers, because as you read news, you start engaging in those news, you start liking, commenting, sharing on those topics, and you also start interacting with people who share similar views like you. And that creates an echo chamber. Basically, you listen, there is a feedback where you basically hear what they mirror, what you think, they tell what you feel. So this leads to polarization. But this formation has this is the what is a public general opinion, and it is intuitive, we think. But this is a contested field, because Dutton et al. In 2017 came out with a paper where they spoke about, they did measurement studies and said that that's not actually true. People tend to get, it depends on self selection of news or social network selection of news, just not pre selection of news by algorithms. And because of that, you might be exposed to different thoughts and all, which happens on Twitter mostly. So the research is still ongoing on polarization and hyperpartisanship. How is this happening? Whether we were always hyperpartisan or whether disinformation has actually created this hyperpartisanship is something which is an ongoing area of research. And to comment on it now and say that yes, hyperpartisanship is happening is to open myself up to a lot of methodologically and research methodologically questionable questions. But what cannot be denied is that while democratic conversation has increased, one does see a contraction of democracy, in the sense that political power, money power, which was always there before, controlled the discourse, still seems to control discourse on platforms as of now. because they tend to, with the black hat PR firms and all, they tend to corner the lion's share of online platform space. So with this, I would summarize that which Khan has given two aggregator models of disinformation is that disinformation works in two types. One is called the passive aggregator model, which is basically a politically motivated interest group. I'm only talking about political disinformation because medical disinformation and economic business disinformation was was there always. Like it was always there in corporate competition. It's always there. Political disinformation from 2016 started developing more. So there are two basic models which can be used to study this. One is the which is Kahn's 2017 he had given. One is called the passive aggregator model, where you have on the one hand you have the politically motivated interests, you have misinformation supply, there is a demand, and this demand is from a credulous public, a public willing to buy that disinformation. That's called the passive aggregator model. And the second is called the motivated public model, where a culturally, this is from the demand side. The previous one was from the supply side, where a politically interested party supplied misinformation through the misinformation supply chain to the credulous public. And you have the motivated public model, which is from the demand side, where you have a culturally motivated public, not a credulous public only, but a culturally motivated public who wants that disinformation. And there is that and from instead of a misinformation supply, you have a misinformation demand, and you have the creation of opportunistic informers. So these are the two basic models of disinformation which can be used to frame the entire topic as of now. It's very easy to deal with it at present. So with this, I will round up my discussion. It came to almost an hour. So if there is any question or if you want something, please let me know. So Savitri, should I mute myself and close my video for the Q&A before I answer, so that the people who want to ask questions can show themselves? Means how does this go about? Let me know.
No, you can put your videos and microphone on. No
Okay.
problem.
Okay. So if there are any questions, please let me know.
Yeah, so thank you, Shangita, for such an insightful and informative lecture. So it has been really a very useful and enriching for all of us, I believe, and we have come across new knowledge on disinformation, misinformation, and all the related topics and areas. And I'm sure this would really benefit us, benefit all of us present over here, and enhance our knowledge in the area. So before going to the question answer session, just I want to make one announcement that feedback link has already been shared in the chat box, and this link will be active up to today 9:30 p.m. Please do fill up this feedback form. This is necessary for generating e-certificate. So participants are requested to please fill up the feedback form. This is active until 9:30 p.m. tonight. So I will request Shangita to take a few quick questions. The first question is from Professor Tajinder Singh. Am I audible, Shangita?
Yeah. You're audible. Please.
Yeah. My question. He says that my question is that how a common man can know about the validity of genuineness of information provided by digital media and print media. And there is another one, which platform can help a common man in this regard?
Okay. May I know the name? Professor Rajinder Singh.
Tajinder Singh.
Jinder Singh. Oh, sorry. Thank you for the question. May I call you all by your first name? Sorry. So thank you, Tajinder, if I may, for your question. And that's exactly That's the main question. That is what keeps us awake at night. That we can all quantificate and go all abstruse about disinformation in our ivory towers, but when it comes to the common person, the lay person, how do they distinguish between this? Okay, so let me tell you what my last 2 years experience. I think that would be a better way of of answering this question. So this was basically what I wanted to know when I came to India in 2018 December. Uh, from 2000, even before the election campaigns had started, to travel to know, because WhatsApp had become a huge source of disinformation, and I was focusing on Facebook and WhatsApp, which have the largest user base of people, and most people. I was also looking at ShareChat and Hello, which were uh, which were vernacular messaging services through which the rural public, mostly the rural public, many of them were much more tech savvy than many of us, were actually getting information. And there, what we found is that WhatsApp has started something called, there is a number that you can send if you are not, if you're unsure of that information. They had said spread love, don't spread rumor, even on the back of the beef lynching cases and all these things. So there is uh, Digital India Foundation. There's by Osman Manzar. He started in New Delhi based, where he started WhatsApp, partnered with many of these civil society organizations for uh, awareness campaigns, digital awareness campaigns, and digital literacy campaigns, where the only way that can be done is just like how disinformation is being done in a micromanaged way right down to the ground level. Like every political party at every vote constituency has a social media handler with 100 contacts spreading disinformation. Similarly, you need to deal with something of that scale. You also need a counter force of counter narrative, of counter awareness, and that is not possible. Practically, that's impossible given the lack of money and funding to do something like that. What can be done is through this huge awareness campaigns in which there's no other alternative to it. There's no other alternative. Where number one, you need to show that what exactly is this information, educate them, and that has been done brilliantly in certain schools in Kerala. And I found that in certain schools in Kerala, right, educate the children at the level so that they can educate their family members. Previously, it used to be said that educate the mother and the family gets educated. Now it has become educate the child and the family gets educated. So educate the children about, spotting the disinformation types. Like as I have given that, what else one way of doing it, those 6 categorization is one way of spotting, is this correct or not? There are helpline numbers. There is something called reverse imaging. Teach them about reverse imaging, about finding out in Google. And it is very easy. You don't need to be a technically proficient person to reverse image something to find out. Google also has Google also has a facility of fact checking where if you are unaware of a post being true or false, you can put that post on Google and find out. So we need to inform the layperson of these things in a massive scale, which the government can do, which the educational institutions can do. If the government cannot do it, then we need to do it. Civil society organizations need to do it because the government has an interest in not doing it, or the political parties have an interest in not doing it. So it would be better for we can't always offload the responsibility on platforms because it becomes very difficult for platforms to do it. Somebody asked a brilliant question here. I will come to that. But Musharraf Hussain, yeah. So, this is one way. Second way, first is awareness. Second way is disincentivize it. Create Germany has done it with its law about any false post you post. They have made platforms responsible for it. Platforms have to pony up huge cash as fines if they don't take down false and malicious posts. In Germany, it is easier to do because the language is pretty similar, so it is easier for fact checkers to find it. But in India, given that every state you have multiple languages and the nuances differ, so it's very difficult to find out wrong information. But false information can be disincentivized at the community level. State might use it as a punishing tool for detractors, but at the community level, if it is disincentivized, and it starts with you. I would recommend, believe me, because I have been basically a fly on the wall on many WhatsApp groups. And I feel that as soon as, whether it is your friends group or your family group, it starts with, as soon as you tell them, no, dad, mom, uncle, whatever, it's wrong, please show your source. That's one way. A community level uh, system has to be created. This is all long-term process. This is the hard yards. People have to do the hard yards to, reverse the tide. And this is a long-term process. And the long-term process starts with individual action. Given that disinformation is also spread from individual to individual, and disinformation gets amplified by misinformation. State spread or political top-down disinformation gets spread by people willing to believe it, and they become misinformers. So as soon as you disincentivize it, that stops. So awareness campaigns and making it community level, at the community level, unacceptable to spread disinformation. This is a political socialization process which has to be done. I don't know whether that answers it, but there are many communities actually working to create awareness.
Okay. The next question is from Dr. Sritanuka Nath. The question is how to distinguish disinformation and misinformation.
Huh. What's the name? Sorry, I'm very sorry. I didn't take it.
Dr. Sritanuka Nath. Dr. Sritanuka Nath.
Sritanupa. Yes. Thank you for the question, Sritanupa. It's actually easy because disinformation is something which is not spread by your uncle or your auntie or your social or somebody in your society. They are misinformation if they spread it. Disinformation is something that comes, you can make out that if anything that is from the top down, from the state level, from the political party level, any information that sounds different, or it is spread by broadcast media of that particular party or any partisan media, then it is something, anything that is top down, we tend to see that, because if there is an intent to do harm, or if there's intent to persuade, or there is an intent to do propaganda, there are different functions. It's just not to do something totally bad. Disinformation can also be to project someone as as if Jesus Christ walking on the river or something like that. It can be something like that also. So can create a cult figure. So anything that is from the top level, that is disinformation, whether it is from the party apparatus or whether it is from the partisan websites, partisan imposter websites, those are disinformation. Anything that you can clearly see as having power at the high top level. Misinformation is at the community level. When people spread it. So someone has written, for example, that this political party is responsible for generating, has generated political violence in this area, where they may not have generated that violence in that area, but everybody on Facebook says, because Facebook and Twitter is an outrage machine. This is terrible. We should punish them. without even going and fact checking, and they start spreading it. They are misinformers. So, so is that clear? So if you don't check and you still believe it, and but you are not the creator of it, then you are basically the spreader of it. You are the misinformer. And if you are the creator and the disseminator of it from the top level, you are the. This is actually the most cut and dried kind of definition I'm trying to give it. There are nuances, but just to make it easier, this is the kind of to remove the definitional ambiguity to it some extent. This is what I would say. It's all about the intent. So check the intent and check the agent to distinguish between the between disinformation and misinformation. Yeah.
And he is also asking that the Dr. Nath is also asking that what are the implications of these two, disinformation and misinformation. Taposh Pai, may I request you to please stop presenting your screen? Please stop presenting your screen, Taposh Pai. Taposh Pai, can you hear? Okay, okay, thank you. So what are the implications of disinformation and misinformation? Dr. Nath is asking.
Yes. So disinformation cannot work without misinformation. Both work in conjunction. I can tell a false news. Suppose I'm not this great politician, I can say a false news. I can do propaganda. But if I don't have an attentive public who's going to be, decide to spread it, I will not get that kind of traction for the disinformation to work. So the implication of disinformation is that disinformation works in conjunction with misinformation to manipulate the narrative, the discourse, makes set certain agendas in the public mind, create certain policy priorities in the public mind. The more successful a disinformation campaign is if it has more misinformers supporting it. And then you will have whatever be the agenda of that particular disinformation campaign gets realized through the credulous public or through the motivated public, depending on what kind of public is catering to the disinformation.
Okay, the next one is from Professor Shilpi Srivastava. Uh, she's asking that difference between misinformation, disinformation, and null information. Part of this question is already answered, I think.
Yeah, malinformation is, thank you, Shilpi. Malinformation is basically information that there's clear intent to do harm. So disinformation can also be malinformation. Like, for example, hate speech. Disinformation can also be about persuasion, promotion of someone. It can be that. It cannot always be something bad. But malinformation is bad. There is a mischief element to it. It needs to do harm. It needs to generate animosity between communities. It needs to uh, create some real, from online violence to offline violence. There will be some sort of ramification there. So malinformation is the intent to do harm. It's a bad information. Yeah.
Professor Nisha Sharma, she writes that how to differentiate information and disinformation, because nowadays everyone has various sources in support of the every news, and it's very difficult to believe which is false or correct.
Sorry, I didn't get you. What was the first part of your question?
How to differentiate information and disinformation, because
Yeah. Nisha. Yeah.
Nisha.
Yeah. Thank you, Nisha. Yes, that is the thing. That is why we call it the information disorder. There is a multiplicity of information sources, and the question that we need to deal with is: does the plurality of information sources reflect plurality of perspectives and truths? Are we living in a multiverse of truths? So something can be true. So is this information true or false? So what is disinformation. Let me just make it even simpler. Like, what is information which is factually correct and information that is factually incorrect? So that is, you may have access to a plurality of sources, but you are what your sources are. You are what the news you read. So if you read a purely propaganda site and frequent propaganda, it's very clear to say now, which is a partisan sites, to the extent that they are openly seen. Everybody says that all news sites have some amount of partisanship, but the levels of partisanship, the levels of fact checking, the levels of credibility, there are benchmarks that whether this, for instance, if you go to a fact checking site, I would recommend see whether the fact checking site has FICN certification, which is a global fact checking certification to show that you have met certain benchmark criteria for being a fact checking site. So that's one way of finding out information and disinformation, because it has to be cleaning up your sources. It's not about the number of volume of information you read, but the kind of information you read. So to differentiate between information which is factually correct and information that is factually incorrect, always good to go with sources that uh, have certain global benchmarks like FICN for fact checking sites, for news and broadcast media and all. It's always good now to go and check out the. If, unfortunately, that is, if you see the Reuters report, which has been recently released, Reuters Institute report on news channels and media, digital news media and all. That's the fact that is, it has become a global concern that given that most of these opinions are being peddled as facts, how do we distinguish between information and disinformation? No two ways about it. People will have to learn the processes right from the school level of checking multiple sources which are different to at least come to some sort of an idea. But your biases play into it. Only thing you have to see is the fact checking done. Now, each media, one good way is that each media has a fact checking team that deals with it. And given that digitalization is in a big way, even if someone is factually incorrect, they get called out for it. So you can check out the ranking of sources, and accordingly, this can be done. But when it comes to the first question, if I pedal back to the first question about how a layperson deals with it, then that's a work in progress, because always there has been information. There has been an information that has been partisan. So finding out fact checking is only by training yourself. One great thing is that digital fact checking is available now through platforms. Facebook allows it, Twitter allows it. If you're unsure of something, you can always you can report the post to Facebook for fact checking and find out. Or you can, now platforms are being pressured. Yeah.
So there is another question from Dr. Sritanuka, that how to identify an information to be disinformation or misinformation in this online era. So part of has this question been answered already?
Yeah, I think I have answered this, because there are many ways in which you can do. You have to first check your source. Where are you getting the information? What is the about page telling you? Is the about page truly partisan? And now it is easy to find out truly partisan sites, because they wear their partisanship on their sleeves. So it's very easy to find. So that is the first red flag. Second, how many how many fact checking strikes they have against it. To do that, find out the for whichever country that you are finding that news from. There is a network which gives you which are the credible fact checking organizations. So go to the fact checking organization. You can send them an email asking them whether this is correct or not, or they themselves will disprove, debunk fact checking. Easiest way is Google reverse imaging, image based information. If it is text based information, you can again go to Google and get it. They have a dedicated section on false news. Google has an extension on false news. So you can always check out an information there simply by copy pasting the information and putting it into the Google false news section. You just go to Google and type it, you will get it. Yeah.
Okay. The next question is from Professor Abdul Hadi. Ma'am, please explain the merits and demerits of shadow campaigning.
Oh yeah. Sorry, what's
Professor Abdul Hadi.
Abdul? Yeah. If I Yes, so there are no basically merits to shadow campaigning. It's always demerits because shadow campaigning, anything that works and operates in the shadows, usually tends to be, unless it's a vigilante for some great justice and all, tends to be bad. So the demerits, there are no merits to it as such because if there is any campaigning, it needs to be by its very nature and ramifications for democratic transparency. It needs to be above board. Uh, Demerits obviously are many. Shadow campaigning leads to character assassination of people, online doxing and harassment of people, offline call to violence campaigns against them. It leads to like shadow campaigning is mostly negative. So there is smear jobs, there's hit jobs against opponents where you try to pull down it. And it's also fear. It creates also a system of fear where they create a sense that there is a mass opinion against you and the mass is highly angry and that mass doesn't like you and therefore don't talk. So it leads to a chilling effect. It leads to people self-censoring themselves. So there are an immense, that's why I ended my talk saying that while there is democratic conversation happening, the voices, there is a contraction of democratic representation happening in a way here. Because only the powerful are actually appropriating the digital spaces and silencing criticisms. And platforms are enabling them because of the social contagion effect of platform, which is fear, anger, will be algorithmically driven, will get more of a boost than feel good stories. Yes.
Yeah, the next question is again from Professor Abdul Hadi. He's asking that I think there is a positive correlation between democracy and disinformation. What is your opinion regarding this?
See, I have not done a correlation story. I was trying to do a correlation and regression analysis of WhatsApp-based disinformation with offline violence. So let me answer the question in that way. What I did find that places where there is a high social media presence, uh, WhatsApp rumors tended to lead to violence, and this I have noticed. This there I have found a positive correlation here that there is a positive correlation between social media density, where in states of India, where there is a higher social media presence, those states, and the outlier was Kerala. I did not find that in Kerala, so I guess there are other factors involved in it, like literacy and all. But taking a few variables, which usually lead to political violence, I try to find the correlation between uh, disinformation defined in terms of WhatsApp rumors, and violence. And I did find a correlation between that. So if you want to extrapolate that into the larger question of democracy and disinformation, positive correlation is something I would need to work on. But at least there is this correlation here.
Shongita, your voice is cracking.
Yeah, was it audible what I said before? Am I clear now?
Yeah, you're clear.
So where did I stop making sense? Means where did I stop making? I was not heard. So do you want me to repeat the positive correlation? I think every so to quickly recapitulate what I said is that in my study I have found a positive correlation between accounting for other variables of communal violence, political violence, and defined in terms of communal violence. I found a positive correlation between social media density and and voting violence. So if there are rumors, like WhatsApp rumors were my focus when I looked at social media density. So if you want to extrapolate that information into a positive correlation between disinformation and democratic contraction, there is a work which we need to see. Disinformation cannot be good for democratic expansion. So I'm looking at it as democratic contraction. Yeah.
Okay, the next question is from Professor Kaushik Dash. He writes that what is the last one disinformation types?
Sorry.
What is the last one disinformation types? I think he's asking about what is the last in the category.
No,
So
I didn't get your question. I'm sorry.
what is the last one? Professor Kaushik Das, can you please elaborate this? You can unmute yourself and ask the question directly. Professor Kaushik Das, if you are there, please ask the question directly. Unmute yourself. Uh, okay. Then the next question is from Professor Musharraf Hussain. Are we heading towards a society where the phenomenon of e-marginalization will occur led by disinformation and e-radicalization?
Yeah, that was the question. If you could just repeat it once more.
Yeah. Uh, this is from Professor Musharraf Hussain. Are
Yeah.
we will I repeat the question?
Yeah, please, please.
Yeah. Are we heading towards a society where the phenomenon of e-marginalization will occur led by disinformation and e-radicalization?
Yeah, this is a question which struck me because I really liked this question when I was. I think it was at the end of my talk when I could actually see the conversation card. Uh, yes, this is a very good question, and this is what this is. If disinformation is allowed full sway, it will definitely lead to e-marginalization, and it will definitely lead to radicalization because whose voices? Ultimately, the whole promise of online platforms was that it was going to lead to different voices being heard. It was going to be an empowering platform and space. There was this promise of a democratic revival, and all these hopes was generated with the Arab Spring and the risings in the West Asian countries where social media was used as an instrument of protest, rhetorics of protest, of dynamics of protest, of getting people together and creating this. That promise fell through. After we see this massive disinformation campaign becoming when major state powers actors entered the fray. It started with foreign intervention campaigns, where in diplomacy it was used to put down another country, like, for example, the Germany and the Russian case, or the US and the Russian case. But then we started seeing domestic play out of information campaigns. As I said in my talk, that always see who are the agents who are dominating the conversation. What is the message of these agents? What's the interpretation they are imputing to these messages? what kind of values are they prioritizing? And if it is always a top-down kind of an information that is happening, which is being spread by the bottom-up misinformation people. So from disinformation, people get spread by the misinformation community level. Then obviously it leads to the marginalization of the traditionally marginalized voices because anyway they were not getting a voice. And if even in the digital platform, those who are politically powerful and political and economically rich uh, tend to dominate the discourse, then even platform affordances will not lead to an egalitarian society or a more representative society. So yes, it's leading to radicalization in the sense that people tend to believe the top-down propaganda if that is the only information they hear, and it leads to marginalization that segues from that is that if they only hear those voices, then the other voices will not get a proper hearing.
Okay, and the last question, I believe this is the last question, is this is from Professor Mohammed M. Hawk. Don't you think that in India, e-managerial schemes need to be launched by the social activist for a proper smart generation as a disinformation lacks on a larger scale?
Sorry, is it e-managerial schemes?
E-managerial, yeah.
So if you could please elaborate on exactly, I'll be able to answer it better. Means exactly what do you mean by e-managerial? Otherwise, I will try to interpret it my way. So if you could please
Uh,
try.
Professor Hawk, are you there? Are you there?
Yeah, good evening.
Yeah, you can please
Actually,
elaborate.
for the e-managerial schemes, I want to show up that for the e-contentment, because for the e-contentment is much more lacking because the awareness system. For that awareness system, I'm trying to show up as a terminology of the e-managerial scheme, as for the IT professionals often used or the cyber crimes specialists often used. Because that things, I think that it's been very much lacking in India, other than European part or the American part. That's the only point I want to suggest.
Yes, yes, I get you. Yes, yes. Yeah. So when I was talking about the containment part, I'm talking about how civil society organizations were pooling in their resources. Uh, For-profit organizations also were coming on board for this to create at the micro level, create awareness campaigns and community disincentivize at the community level disinformation and misinformation. Spreading of basically, let's not use these terms, let's stick to the false news. Let's talk about junk news. So, how do you curb those? I'm not even going to the hate speech area because that's problematic given the kind of country we I mean there are a lot of pressures and pulls here, but hate speech is also very important here. So two levels: false news and problematic extreme speech. Let's call it extreme speech, hate speech. At that level, uh, just like you have, there are like Internet Freedom Foundation, Access Now, uh, there are many think tanks and organizations which are actually pushing towards Center for Internet and Society in India for trying to push towards uh, better guidelines to safeguard digital liberties and also target false news to some extent. Fact checkers, which are certified by FICN, are trying to do that. India Spend is doing it. Alt News is doing it. Center Alt News has openly called itself center left, but it has an FICN certification, so it's doing it well. Boom Live, SMS hosts, they are doing it. They are they are doing it, but they are also they are crowdfunding themselves to do it. So e-managerial way of doing it, if there is any for-profit kind of a system of containing news, let me just talk about for-profit to do it, then it has to be incentivized for them to actually, curb false news to some extent. So they'll need to tag along with platforms if platforms hire them and make it viable for them. Platforms are opening up to third parties in this way to becoming fact checkers. But at the ground level, you can call it management of news that way. If you want to use the term e-managerial, yes, you can management of information flow in a way that the good content gets passed and the bad content gets gatekept. Like basically putting the gatekeeping function of traditional media. So yeah, that can be done, but what is the incentive? That it has to be incentivized. So that is something that needs to be done. Unless people are incentivized to create companies to fight false news, it will not happen. And given the business ecosystem we have in majority of the countries, that is a work in progress.
Uh, uh, there is another question.
Yeah, could you give me just 1 minute? I just have to answer my doorbell. Give me just 1 second, if I may.
Yeah, yeah, okay. Actually, your voice is cracking. I thought that you have stopped.
No, no, no.
Okay. Okay.
I'm sorry, I'm in Bengal and I seem to have people coming here in my house. I don't know from where. Just give me 1 minute.
Okay, that's fine. So in the meantime, I will request all the participants that to fill up the feedback form, and the certificate will reach you within next 7 days. That is within next Friday, we can expect the certificate. So certificate feedback form, filling up the feedback form is necessary for the certificates. Okay. So in between, I am just making another announcement
Also,
that
I'm just so sorry because this
okay, fine.
I seem to have had a weird situation right now because, as you all know, I'm stranded in India, and I seem to have people coming and coming to my house without any clue. I don't know who they are. Anyway,
Yeah. So should we continue, Shangita?
yeah, sure, go ahead.
Okay. Musharraf, Professor Musharraf Hosseini, he is writing your opinion about mechanism to counter that heading towards marginalization.
Sorry, I didn't get you. What did you say? Could you just be a bit?
Professor Musharraf Hussain, are you there? If you are there, please unmute yourself and ask the question directly. Professor Hussain?
Hello.
Yes, yes, yeah.
Hello. Am I audible?
Yes, yes, you are audible.
Yeah. Actually, this question is is a continuation of the last question that I made about emarginalization. That we are heading towards emarginalization due to this misinformation or e-radicalization. This is just I want to ask or know man's view on how to counter that shift to that emarginalization. That means any mechanisms or any ideas, or that's what I want to just know from ma'am.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Actually, this is one question which is something that personally connects with many of our researchers. And this is not just a question that is India perspective, but it is also something which my friends in Brazil, my friends in Philippines have been thinking in it. And this has become more, become more so after the rise of populist leaders who have tended to use platform affordances to create particular narratives. Okay, so how do you counter it? So this is something that is what we are trying to figure out. How do you counter it? And that is why platforms, first is that there has always been in society, there has always been existing cleavages, there has always been prejudices. It's not something that has been manufactured suddenly now. It's always been there. What is different is that platforms have given this an outlet in a big way. So platform responsibility, in that sense, digital platforms like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, now no longer TikTok, WhatsApp, all of these have been for the past 2 years especially, given that many elections are coming up. Last year there were many elections in different countries. They were given a set of recommendations by many of the researchers. I was grateful to be part of some of these things, where we were told where we could study how it was impacting micro communities, marginalized communities, and how they could get a voice. So in that sense, uh, if you are getting some of the things is that platforms don't have that superpower. They don't understand also things, but they also need to be guided. So in that way, communities need to come up here. So one of the recommendations is that takedowns, Facebook takedowns is called. Any post that is a hate post, it has become very easy. Since if you see the last 2 years, platforms have started making the reporting mechanism stronger. So if you find, however muscular a power is in terms of political clout and monetary power, those those they can basically still be taken down. Donald Trump's post was taken down if the community that perceives itself to be marginalized starts reporting posts in a big way. So reporting posts, don't take anything lying down. That's what we are trying to create the sense of thing that trolling is terrorism. Don't take things lying down. Report posts, create alternative discourses, create your own presence on platforms and keep at it. But if it is always confrontationary, then it can create problems. But if it is trying to counter claim, that may work better. So get your voices heard by immediately countering a claim. Here, I would suggest something called sea lioning. Don't engage into posts which are called sea lioning posts. That is, a random person might ask, "What do you mean by this? What do you mean by that?" They might be partisan people to shut you up. Don't engage in clearly think. Instead, directly report to platforms. That in way, and create your own pockets of influence and try to network with each other. And platforms allow that kind of networking, backlinking, and networking abilities. So there are many marginalized communities who are trying to come together to do it. During certain protest movements, we have seen it. In the Black Lives Movement, we have seen it. If you notice something, few years back, the Black Lives Movement was dismissed. It was seen as not as important as civil rights movement of the 650s, 60s, and the early times. Black Lives Movement suddenly now has gained traction. Why? Why are they getting that kind of voices are being heard? Because they are reporting posts which are patently racist. They are not engaging with other races. They are directly engaging with platforms. Secondly, they are creating their own pages and communities and interlinking with them. If we see that many ultra right-wing or ultra left-wing communities, they tend to link with each other more. But those who are in the center right and center left don't. And they are a divided house amongst themselves. So the marginalized communities are divided amongst themselves. And there is a problem of cancel culture also, which takes away their online ability to mobilize together. This is the way in which they can create counter narratives. I hope I'm making sense because I'm trying to take a lot of things and distill it, condense it into one kind of a message.
Very much.
Yeah, well, thank you for your question.
So, so we are at the last part of our webinar. So first, I like to thank Shangita for this wonderful session, and we have learned a lot from her. And she has, despite her busy schedule, has found time to grace this session. So we are grateful to you, Shangita. And I extend my thanks to our principal sir for all possible support and encouragement. And I owe my heartiest gratitude to all distinguished I2SC members, without whose continuous support this program would not have been successful. My heartfelt thanks to all my colleagues and friends present over here. And finally, on behalf of the Damdam Motichil Rabindra Mahavidyalaya, I like to express my appreciation to all the participants for taking time out of their busy duties to attend this webinar. So thank you all. Thanks for your attention. So there is a small announcement that we are organizing a webinar on 7th of July. This is organized by Department of Education in collaboration with I2SC, and this will be on coping with stress and managing education in the context of COVID-19 pandemic, the whole institutional approach. Dr. Mrinal Mukherjee, Assistant Professor and Coordinator, Department of Educational Planning and Administration, the West Bengal University of Teachers Training, Education Planning and Administration, Kolkata, has given his kind consent to speak on that day. So we cordially invite all of you to be present on that day. So thanks once again for being with us. Thanks once again, Shangita, for such a nice lecture. Thank you all.
I wish you all the best, and I hope you all also think about this as a research topic, as you would like more and more people from the globe out. Thank you all. I log off now?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So we are ending this session. Sir, we are ending. Sir?
Yes, madam, yes.
Yes, okay. So, please, participants are requested to please leave the meeting.